Welcome to the latest edition of the National Yiddish Theater Folksbiene Live program. I'm Bud Mishkin. Thank you for joining us. Our guest today, a great New Yorker, Mrs. Louise Kerz Hirschfeld Cullman, who is the former president of the Al Hirschfeld Foundation. Louise, thank you for joining us today. How are you today at this unprecedented time?
Well, I'm very excited about this conversation with you because it brings me back to a very joyous time in my life with Al Hirschfeld.
So when did you first meet Al Hirschfeld, and when did you first become aware of his art?
I actually met him when he came to do a drawing of a play that my first husband was producing. It was called Rhinoceros, and it ran on Broadway in 1961. And Al came up to do a drawing of Zero Mostel and Eli Wallach. And the amazing thing about the drawing was that he captured that moment when Zero Mostel turned into a pachyderm and just snorted his way over a village. And it was an anti-fascist comedy written by Ionesco. It was very popular. Laurence Olivier did it in London, but Zero Mostel was the star with Eli Wallach, and they did not use masks at that time.
And so that was the first time that you met him?
Yeah, that was the first time I met him. And I had gone to Europe, to Berlin with my first husband because he was designing a play in Berlin called Der Stellvertreter. And we stayed there for a year. And when I came back, we started a very close and wonderful relationship with Al and Dolly Hirschfeld. We became very fast friends. We were invited to their dinners. We were invited to their home. They came to my son Jonathan's graduation. They were wonderful when during sickness, they made hospital visits. They were terrific. And I was introduced to a kind of extraordinary look at a man whose work was so important to the American theater because it created the single-minded look of one artist, of culture in New York and Europe. And it was an extraordinary moment for me.
Before you got to know Al Hirschfeld better, did you start paying more and more attention to his work and seeing it in the paper, and how did that work?
Actually, it came to me as a great gift and surprise when I saw it in Rhinoceros. The Rhinoceros drawing. And then I studied it. I was on my way to becoming a theater historian. I had given up various things that I wanted to do before. And so I found the work so incredible because it's like a connective tissue to all of the arts in the 20th century.
Mm-hmm. After your first husband died, you eventually married Al Hirschfeld. What can you tell us about his work process? What did you see?
Well, I saw, since we attended many openings together, and I went to some rehearsals with him, I saw a reverential state of a love affair with the theater. Here was a man who was drawing, but he was involved with every aspect of what was going on the stage. If it was a rehearsal, he would listen to what the stage manager was saying or what the lighting guys were doing. If he was at an opening night, his drawing would already have been done. But he paid such attention to everything. And he had the capacity to not only do a drawing first, which was like a rehearsal for him. He could capture, if there were 10 people on the stage, he could capture what all those people were doing. And I remember looking at a drawing of Jerome Robbins that he did later in life. And Jerome Robbins had his hand out, his arm out like this. And Hirschfeld got about 40 different dancers from each of the shows that Jerome Robbins had choreographed. Were all on his shoulder and hands and playing on his fingers. I mean, it was amazing that he could get so much into one drawing. And he could also just do a minimalist drawing. Later on in life, he did Orson Welles sitting in a chair. And it was like just one long line of Mr. Welles. It looked like a wonderful whale that was sort of perched on the seacoast.
I was going to say the notion of Orson Welles and minimalist, perhaps those two phrases don't often go together.
Yes, you're right. But,
in one sentence.
But what I meant was, it was just one single line that went and covered his entire body, and then a few details on the face.
When he was working, was it, okay, I'm going up to work now, you know, unless it's an emergency, you know, I'm in my own zone, or could you interact with him when he was working?
Yeah, that's very interesting that you say that, because I wrote a little bit about that, and I can say that what he would do would be to have a very organized schedule during the day. He would have breakfast, read the New York Times, and he would say, I'm going up to the mines now. And the mines would be his studio, which was on the 4th floor of a townhouse and on the Upper East Side. And so he would walk up the stairs, and someone once said that was his only exercise, going up and down his stairs to his drawing board. He didn't go out very much, he didn't walk very much, but that exercise of knowing that a new drawing was waiting, or something was waiting to be completed, was his sustenance, his artistic sustenance. And I'm reminded, as I see those wonderful sculptures behind you, that the kind of work that Al Hirschfeld had was a combination of several elements. He was a sculptor, he was a watercolorist, and he worked his way into caricature. And all those elements made his work very special. It gave the work a kind of three-dimensional look, which is not present usually in the work of caricature. I remember there were dinners that I used to have as he got older. I invited some of the great caricaturists that were in New York, like David Levine, Edward Sorel, and Jules Pfeiffer, and we'd have a dinner party. And then one of them would try and ask, well, Mr. Hirschfeld, they called him Al, what is your secret? And he said, I don't know. It just happens. So he couldn't really verbalize it. And when he was asked in public, well, what is the secret to this extraordinary work that you've done? And he said, it just comes naturally. And that's
the beauty of any great art, that it's a mystery. I remember years ago, 20 years ago, Bob Dylan being asked on 60 Minutes by Ed Bradley about a particular song and the words of a particular song. And it's a song that was called It's All Right, Ma, I'm Only Bleeding. And it was beautiful words to start the song. And Bradley said, how did you do that? And Dylan looked at him like, how should I know? I don't know. And I couldn't do it again. But that's the beauty part. By the way, you referenced the beautiful sculpture behind me. This comes to us, I feel compelled to say, from the great international sculptor who just also happens to be my father-in-law, the retired pathologist, Paul Smilo, who has provided this for today. He has not paid me to say that, but we're looking into that.
They're really wonderful, yes.
Can you tell me some examples of, younger generations of New York, when you say the word Nina, it won't mean anything to them. But for other generations, like my generation, of course, we know the story of Nina and trying to find the Ninas in Hirschfeld's work. Are there examples of times when it came to you through other people telling you, wow, this is really a thing, for want of a better term, and this is really important in people's lives, finding the Nina?
Right. I'm so glad you brought that up because it gives me the chance to talk about the first New Year's party that I went to at the Hirschfeld home after I came back from Berlin, and suddenly the place was jammed with people from Broadway and other places, and suddenly Nina came down the stairs. She was quite a ravishing red-headed teenager, and she looked a lot like her mother, who was a petite movie star in her day, Dolly Haas. And there were a flood of young men around just waiting for her to come down the stairs. And that was the girl that Al Hirschfeld sort of immortalized in his drawings. When she was born 75 years ago, he put her in a drawing to welcome her on the earth. And so that went on for a few weeks, and then he decided to stop it. And then the guys at the Times who were working in the print room complained. They said, look, we've got bets out who can find the most Ninas in the drawing. And so he said, I decided to continue. And so she became a very famous theater child. And she wanted to go into the theater, actually, and studied the piano. She was a wonderful pianist. She studied with Nadia Boulanger in Versailles one summer. She was that good. But then she gave it up. But one year I was traveling from South Africa to London, and the woman next to me started a conversation, and we talked a little about, she said, oh, by the way, what's your name? And I said, Louise Hirschfeld. And she said, oh gosh, Hirschfeld is such a wonderful memory for me because it reminds me of Al Hirschfeld and Nina. And I said, oh, tell me. And she said, well, I used to look for the Ninas with my grandmother on Sunday mornings. We'd have a special time where we would sit down and have breakfast, and it reminds me of her. And she started to cry. And I almost cry when I think of the story, because that story is not unique. I've heard many, many stories. There was a girl from Japan who sort of said the same thing, that they looked for the Ninas. I couldn't believe it, but it became a kind of universal puzzle to do. At one point, at the Museum of Broadcasting, I met Robert Kennedy's widow, Ethel, and she said, your name is Hirschfeld? I said, yes. And she said, you know, that's the first thing that Bobby and I in the family used to do. We'd look for the Hirschfeld. We'd look for the Ninas in the Hirschfeld drawing. So it kind of was a universal puzzle that was wonderful, and people still do it. But
how good were you at finding the Ninas?
Well, I started to look for them. I felt I had to know where they were. but I wanted to say one thing about the Ninas. There was one drawing that Al did in 1968, and that was a drawing of hippies and protagonists, and it was the play called Hair.
Mm-hmm.
And when I saw that drawing, I was looking for some Ninas. I saw the drawing, and I said to myself, I can't believe how Al has captured this social and political movement. And this is so stressed in the musical Hair. It says so much about what's happening. It was an anti-war movement. It was a protest. It was a social revolution. And I said, that's part of his secret. He can transform when there are these things that are happening in the world. He was able to go with the flow, so to speak. And he was able to, it was one of the reasons that he was able to live longer and work longer and be happy in spite of all the changes.
Mm-hmm.
I remember Frank Rich once asked him how it was with 9/11 when he heard the news. And he said, I couldn't believe it. It was the beginning of a religious war. And he said, it's impossible, but I know that we have to go on. And that was one of his secrets.
When you look at the people who sat for portraits, caricatures for Hirschfeld, it's like a who's who. Just a couple of them that you've referenced: Ella Fitzgerald, caricature Ella Fitzgerald, Anne Bancroft, the great actress Anne Bancroft.
Yes, I wanted to say that he was very proud. He was a man who was tuned in also to music of the time. Don't forget, he was alive and well and dancing during the jazz age. And the music of that period was extraordinary. He could capture that in his drawings of musicians, of Louis Armstrong, he was very proud that he first went to Harlem and he heard Ella Fitzgerald sing A Tisket, a Tasket.
Yeah.
And she was about 16 years old, and she was absolutely fantastic. And the drawing is so beautiful. The picture of Anne Bancroft came from an exhibit that was in Hollywood when the film of Al Hirschfeld's life, which was directed by Susan Dreyfus, opened. And there was an exhibit that the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences also put on. And during that period, Carl Reiner and his wife had a party for us. Mm-hmm. And the only people that were invited were Anne Bancroft, her husband, Mel Brooks, and Larry Gelbart, who was a great comic writer, and his wife. And so it was 8 people. And Carl Reiner had the most wonderful party for Al. He put him in the middle of a room and he bought pads and pencils for everybody so that they could draw him. And I could see that he started getting a little red. He was starting to get nervous. He said, now I know what someone feels like when I'm drawing them. And that was
a good lesson. It's a very good lesson.
And it was a good point for him. And
so being at a dinner party with Carl Reiner and his wife and Mel Brooks and Anne Bancroft, this is a small dinner party. This is not a reality that 99.99, the late and great Carl Reiner. This is a reality that most of us were never in, will never be in. So what's that like at that time and other times that you're mingling and having conversations with and getting to meet people, forget about the fact famous, that's a whole nother issue, but people whose work is really influential and is known around the world. What was that like for you?
Well, the first years that I was there, I just listened and I didn't participate very much, although my husband was an anti-Vietnam War person and spoke up quite vehemently about that all the time. And it was interesting to hear what other people how they would tune into that. And the incredible thing about the dinner parties was that Al and Dolly invited people who were old friends and who may have been struggling at the time.
Mhm.
And there may have been an author whose last play was on Broadway 10 years ago, or a director had come in from Hollywood who wasn't working anymore, or who's a songwriter whose songs were just about to open, and they'd all be at the same table. And there was a wonderful democratic feeling. Everyone was respected, no matter how the Broadway press agents or the Broadway headlines were.
Mhm.
Everybody was a creative person, whether it was 40 years ago or 20 years ago or next week.
Hmm.
And it gave people a feeling of their craft being important, and not how many times they were produced, either on film or on Broadway. And I sensed that in the beginning. And there were people who were pleased to be there, to be at the table with Hirschfeld. It was a wonderful barometer. It was just terrific.
It says a lot, because it's easy to invite the people who are at the the top of their game at that moment, but to show respect to people who have perhaps professionally fallen on hard times, that says a lot.
And I remember there was almost a fist fight upstairs once, because there was a play that had opened by Patty Chayefsky.
Mm-hmm.
And Patty was there that night for dinner. And Harold Clurman, of course, the great director and reviewer and theater historian, who had actually started the group theater, was there. And Patty said, "Harold, why did you give me such a bad review of my last play?" And he said, "Well, I didn't think that Zero Mostel was that good, or whatever it was, and it didn't last very long." And so Patty got very upset. And so I walked in the middle of them, and I said, "Dinner is served." Everybody went downstairs.
That's, you know what, the best line at a dinner party. Dinner is served.
That's right. And there was another moment after Al died. I used to continue to have some of his friends for dinner. And there was one moment when Elie Wiesel and his wife were there, and the historian
Arthur Schlesinger?
Schlesinger. So
okay.
Arthur Schlesinger and his wife were there. And there had been a piece in the New York Times about Truman and the founding of Israel. And suddenly something was said, and I noticed that the dinner table, something was happening at the dinner table, and I didn't like the feeling of it. Mm-hmm. And so I said, "Oh, shall we go upstairs and look at Al's studio?" And so everybody went upstairs to the fourth floor, and Elie Wiesel sat in Al's barber chair, and it sort of dissipated whatever I thought might be happening there. And
if you're going to throw a dinner party and things are getting a little out of hand, to have the ability to say, "Let's go up and visit Hirschfeld's studio," that's a pretty good one. I hope you're enjoying. This is the latest edition of the National Yiddish Theater Folksbiene Live program. I'm Bud Mishkin. We're joined today by our guest, Mrs. Louise Kerz Hirschfeld Cullman, talking about the art of Al Hirschfeld, and we'll get to some other topics as well. Obviously, he had a huge connection to theater, but he also had a connection by extension to the Yiddish theater, because he did artwork of the show Fiddler on the Roof, but also other shows that connected back to the Yiddish theater. Milk and Honey in the 1960s, a Molly Picon show. There was also a show called Cafe Crown, which was done on Broadway in 1942 and 1988. 1988 featuring Eli Wallach, that had Yiddish theater characters. Fiddler on the Roof, of course, is an international icon, not just a connection back to the old Yiddish theater. Was there anything in particular, like a person like Zero Mostel, even someone who's a non-artist could look at a Zero Mostel and say, "Oh, what a great character to draw"? could he define, or would he define to you, that person is going to be a good character to draw?
Well, it's very interesting that you bring that up, because Zero Mostel was in person a very interesting person, and he was always sort of on. Al said that in the 1930s he did a cafe act where he imitated a coffee pot percolating. So maybe you get an idea of what he was doing with his spare time. You know, he was larger than life, and his roles that he took were usually larger. He was such a really extraordinary actor, and he could not always be contained by a director. He would start to do things on his own. I heard stories about Fiddler on the Roof and Jerome Robbins, and he would sometimes go into improvisations. But yes, if there was someone like Zero Mostel, there was also someone like Carol Channing, who was just large, you know, large inside and bursting with energy. Carol Channing came to dinner one night, and we had a rather small dining room. And when Carol Channing came into the room, it was like electricity went on. It's just all she was doing was walking, walking to a seat. And I felt that this is that mysterious star quality that some people have.
Mm-hmm.
And you know it yourself when you've seen political figures. I once saw Robert Redford give a speech somewhere, and I could feel that something extra celestial, something or other, that people who are larger transmit to an audience.
Right. Something had changed in the room.
That's right. That's right.
Can you discuss your work as the former president of the Al Hirschfeld Foundation? What was the idea behind the foundation, and what was the most important work that you think you did as the former president?
Well, Al Hirschfeld discussed with me before he passed away that there would be a foundation started that would be in his will, and it would be set up to protect his work and to see that there would be educational. We talked about how to preserve his work for future generations as well. Mm-hmm. And so the year after he died, I started the foundation, and I had a very good curator with me, David Leopold, who has worked as the curator all of these years. And I started to think of exhibitions that could be done. Mm-hmm. to start to use the work in different ways, to use it in exhibition form. So the first thing we did was I contacted the Theatre Museum in London, and sure enough, they wanted an exhibit of all the British-related Hirschfeld work. And there was so much, because there was so much British theater and so many stars on Broadway. And it was really a wonderful experience to go. And I contacted Andrew Lloyd Webber and others, and Tony Walton helped. And we just had an extraordinary exhibit. And also the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences had an auxiliary exhibit about the motion picture stars that came to America or worked in film that Al drew. So that was one of the things that happened during my tenure. So I started with a big exhibit in London, and I ended my years there organizing the New York Historical Society's look at Al Hirschfeld's work. As a matter of fact, this book was written by David Leopold, which was an accompanying, it's called The Hirschfeld Century, and there's a nice picture of Al on there.
It is amazing to see, and again, this is for a certain generation of theater lovers and New York Times readers, that you can see a Hirschfeld and just at the drop of a hat, you know it's a Hirschfeld.
Yes.
There's an absolute beauty to that.
Yes, and there's something about, I must say that the New York Times really has to be congratulated, because they had on board, they had two people on board at the Times who were doing things, who were very unusual artists. Another one was Bill Cunningham, the photographer,
Mm-hmm.
who practically lived with his photographs next to the files in Carnegie Hall. I mean, he was a very unusual and talented man. And when the two of them would get together and schmooze a little at an event, I saw two companions who had a very good job and still remained there themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And the interesting thing is that both of them, in the beginning, Al used to bring his drawings to the doorman at the New York Times building. And one day, I think in the 30s, somebody called up and said, have Mr. Hirschfeld come up and deliver the drawing to us. We're on the second floor or whatever. And that was Sam Zolotow and Brooks Atkinson. And then he formed a lifelong friendship with the great critics of the Times. And I think I wanted to say that when Brooks Atkinson did a review of a play, he would highlight, of course, the great moment in the play. Something like The Streetcar Named Desire with Jessica Tandy and Marlon Brando. And you would find that Al Hirschfeld had also highlighted a moment with the two of them together. They would both find that moment that an author was looking for, that supreme moment when actors would fulfill the dream and the words that an author had written. So Al was very close to the creative team.
We're talking with Mrs. Louise Kerz Hirschfeld Cullman. This is the latest edition of the National Yiddish Theater Folksbiene live program. The Folksbiene is one of many cultural institutions in New York that is understandably struggling at this time financially because of the pandemic. If you would be so inclined, we of course would welcome any contribution or donation you could make to the Folksbiene. You can go to their website at nytf.org/donate and donate whatever you can to keep alive this great cultural institution in New York City. Mr. Hirschfeld, of course, is obviously well known in the world of theater and New York Times readers and the art world. After he died, you married Louise Cullman, the philanthropist who was known throughout the world in the world of philanthropy. And we can get to that in a second. Your first husband, Leo Kerz, was involved in the world of theater, perhaps not as quite as well known to the outside world, beyond the theater world, as Mr. Hirschfeld and Mr. Cullman. But that he's a fascinating story. As a Holocaust survivor who left Europe before the war, his parents did not survive the war. What was that like when you met him and when you were married to him? He died young. Was the Holocaust something that would come up in conversation, or was it a topic that, no, we don't discuss that?
I tried to find out as much as I could, but people of that generation were reluctant to really talk very much about thank goodness he was never interned anywhere. He was able to go to South Africa from Berlin with his first wife, who was an Olympic athlete. Martel Jacob was her name. And the stories of survival are so sad. And through him, I learned how people felt, how people tried to remake their lives, how people tried to get on with their lives. And today, actually, in the street in Berlin, there is something called a Stoppelstein, which is a brass plaque that was put into in front of the apartment house where the Kerz family lived. And there were 3 stones there, which have the names of each of his family members that perished at Sobibor. And I went there with my sons when that was put in. I think I wanted to go back to, you mentioned his work as a designer. In 1962, we went to Berlin because he was the designer of the original play Der Stellvertreter, which was a play that explored the Pope's attitude during the Holocaust. It was called The Deputy in English and eventually opened on Broadway. But it was a harrowing experience because not only did the Vatican try to stop the production of the play, but so did various organizations and companies that had participated in the buildup of the Nazi machine.
Do you recall what it was like leading up to going to Berlin for that play? And was
it was a I thought that he had put it behind him, but when we finally went to Berlin and we lived there, I could see the trauma that was involved in his even doing the work. It was just terrible. It was we got through it and he got through it, but it was a very hard and difficult thing to look at the materials, to explore the play itself, and to go to the opening. The German audience wept. It was like a catharsis in a way, and
when you think of 1962, that's only 17 years after the war.
That's right.
And that's like that. I mean, 17 years now is 2003. That's after 9/11. So the notion of it being fresh in 1962, I can't even begin to imagine what emotions were going through him and going through you as you went through it together.
We lived in an apartment in the suburbs of Berlin called the Grunewald, and every house around us still had bullet holes in it, and the wall had gone up for a year. Everything was happening at that time. It was an incredible time because the wall was going up and people were trying to escape from the east into the west, and there were shootings all the time, and it was a very volatile situation, and we were on the front lines of all that. We went to see various plays in the East Zone, and we went through the wall at Checkpoint Charlie. It was a live history lesson for me, and I'll never forget it.
Can I imagine that in that moment, for you, there are some thoughts of, the line from The Wizard of Oz applies so often in our lives. We're not in Kansas anymore. The notion of being in Berlin in 1962 and on both sides, were there moments for you where you just kind of shook your head and wow, How did we get here?
I really could not get over it, but I felt that I had to be there for him because I knew that it was very difficult. We actually went to Poland, and because he gave some talks there to the cultural foundation, and so we were in Warsaw, in Łódź, and in Krakow, Krakow, and of course, just getting a tour of the old ghetto, and I mean, it was just mind-boggling. I can't tell you how extraordinary it was, and also at the same time to live under the communist rule, because Gomulka was still the president of Poland, and when you walked out into the street at night, the voltage must have been about 20 volts in a light bulb, because you were walking down the street and you could hardly see anything. It was like going through a Kafka, the pages of a Kafka book. That's what it was like. And at one point, we were invited to have dinner. They said, this is one old world restaurant that still exists. And so we opened the door to the restaurant, and someone invited us in, and he was wearing an old tuxedo that I could tell had not been cleaned in 40 years. It was sort of standing stiff, on the person. And he invited us in, and there was a single violin playing, and it was playing some old, wonderful, romantic melody, and I said, this is what it was like before. Just a moment of walking into a restaurant.
Wonderful, compelling stories.
I didn't tell you about my trips to Israel, though, did I?
The forum is yours if you'd like to tell us about them.
Okay, I've been to Israel twice. I joined a group of volunteers just as the Gulf War was ending. The American Jewish Congress had called for volunteers, and so I signed up. And when I got to Tel Aviv, when we got to Tel Aviv, and I can assure you, everyone was praying. It was 1991. And I thought the plane was going to tip over because everyone was on that side praying. So we were given a gas mask, and we were then given our assignments. Some people went to hospitals, some people went to schools. I went to a nursing home in Nairobi, which is up near the Sea of Galilee on the coast. And I had an extraordinary 2 weeks there.
After Mr. Hirschfeld died, you married Louise Cullman a couple of years later, and I had the pleasure of interviewing him in 2008. Major figure in the world of philanthropy. And in 2012, you and Mr. Cullman were named New York City Living Landmarks. That's pretty good, to be named a living landmark.
Well, it was quite a surprise to me. And I'm very happy to say that I'm married now to 2 living landmarks. So Al Hirschfeld was one, and Louise Cullman was another. And
now, in being named a living landmark, can you use that if with friends, or perhaps if someone your sons, if they say, hey Ma, can you do this for us? And, hey, my friend, here it says on the card, living landmark here, let's show some respect for the living landmark.
I never use it. I never refer to it. It's in my biography, but I don't use it for any reason. But
that speaks well of you, because if I were named a living landmark, I'm not sure a day would go by that I probably wouldn't mention it to someone.
I do like to go to the to the annual dinner, and I like to hear the new people that are inducted and see if the ones that are still around are seated, and each one of them has given. I mean, I'm very pleased that that Peg Green has had put my name up, but I love to see what people have done for New York, because it is so important. And that's why the National Yiddish Theater is so important, especially in its location downtown, uh, at the museum, and it makes New York what it's supposed to be, and it should be it should be what America should be. New York should be
One of the many institutions that makes New York, New York.
Yes, exactly.
Both the Yiddish Theater, Folksbiene, and also the museum you referenced, the Museum of Jewish Heritage.
Yeah.
As we come back to the work of Al Hirschfeld, as we start to, we could be having this conversation for hours and hours and hours, but which is a wonderful thing. As we start to wrap up, can you tell me about the effort to get a theater named after Al Hirschfeld?
I must say that it's one of the great highlights of my life. That I was sitting around with Arthur Gelb of the New York Times, because we were going to celebrate Al Hirschfeld's 100th birthday. And so we were sitting in his office at the Times, and we said, what can we do? And then, I don't know, the idea of a theater came up, and he said, I'm going to call Rocco Landesman. So we called Rocco, and he said, give me a few weeks. And within 2 weeks, he called back, and he said, we've called the family of the Martin Beck family, and they've agreed, and they would be very happy if we renamed the Martin Beck Theater the Al Hirschfeld Theater. And so that's what happened on Al Hirschfeld's 100th birthday. It was renamed, and I cut a ribbon in front of the building, and the lights went on. But I want to say one other thing, and that is that he knew about it. Al Hirschfeld, Arthur and I said, we're coming up to tell you something, Al. And he was sitting there drawing. And then I said, Al, why did you tell Arthur, why did you tell Al? And he was so thrilled. And he was almost silent. And I could see this deep smile and happiness on his face. And he said, well, now I'll join my friend, Eugene O'Neill and Brooks Atkins, my friends, Eugene O'Neill and Brooks Atkinson, in having theaters named after him. This is such a great honor. Oh. And the other thing that he said was, if you live long enough, everything happens.
I'll take that, duly noted. One other, let's take a little sidetrack here before we finish up. One other great New York character, talk about living long enough, is the writer Belle Kaufman, who best known for writing Up the Down Staircase, based on her experiences as a teacher. And also her connection to the Yiddish theater is that she is the granddaughter of Shalom Aleichem. I again had the pleasure of interviewing her probably about 8 or 9 years ago. Irrepressible is a word that comes to mind. For those who did not know her, give us a couple of minutes about Belle Kaufman.
Well, the idea of getting to know Belle Kaufman was, she was so easy to know. You know, she was an educator, she was a teacher, and she had an immediate warmth, and to me especially. So I knew her for many years, over the years, and she was a constant guest at these dinners. She was elegant, she had flair, she spoke with a little bit of an accent. She was born in Berlin, but of course, Shalom Aleichem was Russian. So she spoke with a little bit of a Russian accent. And there was always a wonderful story that she was telling. And of course, when Fiddler on the Roof started, when they took the story of Tevye, the milkman, and embellished it with music and with the lyrics of Sheldon Harnick, and the beautiful music of Jerry Bach, she was absolutely thrilled. And incidentally, this morning on WQXR, they played a symphonic version of Fiddler on the Roof. And I said, this is my day. And it was absolutely beautiful. Every song that I love, I sang with them, of course. But Belle Kaufman was wise, and she had her husband, Sidney Gluck, ran the Shalom Aleichem Foundation. And I just thought it was a thrill to know her. And she was the last of that era, wasn't she?
You described her well to me the other day. You called her the ultimate European royalty of Yiddish theater.
That's right.
And she was, in all the best sense of the word, she was an unforgettable character.
She was the ultimate royalty of the Yiddish theater. And she wore that crown very, very well.
So Louise, as we start to wrap up, and we thank you for all your time today on behalf of the National Yiddish Theater Folksbiene Live program. And again, people watching, if you so inclined, we would love for you to make a donation to this great organization at nytf.org/donate. Louise, it strikes me that in your life and in your life prior to your marriages, and then with Leo Kerz and some of those experiences you've described, and certainly the many experiences you described with Al Hirschfeld, and then the experiences with Louise Cullman, it's almost like there's almost like a Zelig quality from the great Woody Allen movie from many years ago about this character who pops up in all these different circumstances. And I'm not by no stretch trying to trivialize it, but I'm curious if you're reflective about, wow, where this life has taken you and the people that you've met and the people you've befriended and they've befriended you. Are you at all reflective about that?
I'm very reflective, and I feel that I'm very lucky to have been involved and invited in. And I've been very lucky in my life. And the theater has remained one of my great loves. And I'm sorry, I'm going to miss it for a while.
Well, we hope, among the many things that we hope will lead to a brighter future than what is transpiring right now, live theater. Well, this technology is great, and being able to have conversations this way is wonderful, but needless to say, live theater is still live theater.
Yes.
And one day it will be once again. One last thing about the caricatures.
Yes.
Was there ever a caricature of you?
Oh, yes. There are several.
Good.
And you'll see them. Yes.
Okay.
And actually, the first time he did a caricature of me was after a theater performance. We went to a little restaurant, and there were crayons on the table with drawing paper. And so I was just looking at a menu, whatever. And then suddenly I saw him take a crayon and look at me. And I said, oh, he's looking at me differently. What's happening here? And I could feel my blood going to my face, and I was blushing, and I felt a fever coming on. And he was beginning to do his first drawings of me. And it was thrilling. I never asked for it, and there it was. I wanted to say one other thing that you know, even though I'll miss the theater, I now am closer to my own family. The gift of that Leo Kerz gave me, 2 sons and 6 grandchildren. I've got my own theater going on here.
That's great. That's great. Louise Kerz Hirschfeld Cullman is the former president of the Al Hirschfeld Foundation. This is the National Yiddish Theater Folksbiene Live program. And again, if you're so inclined, we would, of course, welcome if you would be willing to make a donation, any of you watching at nytf.org/donate. Louise, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for the conversation. I look forward to many more.
Can I say one more thing?
You may.
Now, Zellman sang a song.
Zalman is Zalman Malotic, the artistic director of the Yiddish Theater Folksbiene.
Yes. Sang a song the other day that really captured me, and it was called "Papier ist doch weiß und Tinte ist doch schwarz und ich hab Hirschfeld der Maler in mein Herz." That's my poem, my ending poem.
In the translation?
Paper is white and ink is black, and I have Hirschfeld in my heart. What do you think?
Pretty good. I think that's a beautiful way to finish up. What can I possibly say after that? Louise?
A beautiful Yiddish love song.
Stay safe, be well, and thank you again for this hour of conversation.
Thanks so much.
Papier ist doch weiß und Tint ist doch schwarz. Zu dir, mein süß Leben, zieht doch mein Herz. Vollständig gesessen, 3 Tage noch aneinander, zu kuschen dein Schönponnen und zu halten deine Hand. Nächten bei Nacht bin ich auf a Chassene gewesen. Viel schöne Mädels hab ich dort gesehen. Viel schöne Mädels, zu dir kommt nicht gut. Zu deine schwarze Egal, zu deine schwarze Haar.